It's the NFL Playoffs Championship Round preview right here on DraftKings TV. I'm your host, Dan Strafford, in for David Kitchen this week. As always, we have Andrew Wiggins, Adam Levitan, and Geoff Ulrich with us to break down the conference championships. And we have New England at Denver, Arizona at Carolina, 4 teams that many expected to be here. And now we get to break down the contest and go into a 2-game slate, gentlemen. But before we get into the games themselves, let's talk a little bit about injuries and how they'll play a part in this week's contest. Geoff, let's start with you.
Sure, yeah. So looking at the NFC first, Arizona, Carolina. These 2 teams are pretty healthy for the most part. There's a couple key injuries that you might just want to keep an eye on. The most important is probably Jonathan Stewart, who tweaked his ankle, I should say, a little bit at the end of last week's game. He missed practice on Wednesday, which probably isn't that surprising, especially since he's coming off foot issues. But he's someone to keep an eye on. I'd be pretty shocked if he didn't play, considering how important this game is. It's possibly not at 100%, though, so I'd like to see like a full practice maybe by the end of the week, just to be sure. A couple other injury notes, really, just guys on defense. Justin Bethel, cornerback for the Arizona Cardinals, is kind of banged up. If he doesn't play, that's kind of interesting because they already lost Tyrann Mathieu earlier this year, so that just weakens their secondary even more. And then on the Carolina side, I should also say David Johnson was limited in practice too, but it really doesn't look serious with David Johnson, so I wouldn't worry too much about it, although, again, always check the reports on Friday. Something can pop up. And then on the Carolina defensive side, it looks like Jaron Allen isn't going to play this week. He's kind of already been ruled out. I'm not sure how big a factor that's going to be for Carolina. I think he's more of just like a pass rush specialist at this point. So those are really the main injuries from the NFC. Both teams are pretty healthy, which is great. You see both teams at full health. I just keep an eye on Stewart and probably keep an eye on David Johnson as well.
Adam, taking a look at the AFC, New England and Denver. Coming into last week, we had all the news about Edelman, about Gronkowski. Some people may have jumped the gun saying that Gronkowski was a little bit of a decoy with the back injury, with the knee injury, went out and had a big game. We saw what Edelman did. Where do injuries stand for this contest between the Patriots and the Broncos?
Yeah. Before I get, I want to welcome Andrew Wiggins back from India. I'm curious where he had better internet in India or in his apartment in Chicago.
Yeah, the internet was pretty good over there. So sad to say, it might have been better than my internet at home.
Yeah. So I was one of the people that kind of got scared off Gronk a little bit last week. I did have him in a tournament lineup with Brady, which was great, but I didn't really have much exposure to Gronk at all, mostly because I thought he'd be limited, and Kansas City had such a good tight end defense. Then Gronk goes out and plays 91% of the snaps. I would assume that he's going to take whatever same injections. People are insinuating that New England made this whole thing up. He didn't get an injection. His back wasn't bothering him. I don't really think that's true. I think it is bothering him, but obviously nobody is 100% this time of year. They get injections and they play. So I obviously wouldn't be concerned about Gronk at all. If you're going to beat the Broncos, I think it's through tight end more than through the wide receivers. So I think it's a pretty nice spot for Gronk. There's really only 2 options at tight end, and I think Gronk for me is a little bit ahead of Greg Olsen. Yeah, and on the Edelman stuff, I expected him to be fully healthy. Hadn't played since week 10, but had been practicing for a month, so he was obviously himself. Got 16 targets, and I think he's in a good spot this week with Chris Harris banged up. And that brings me to the other side. Chris Harris was probably the best or at least top 3 corner in the NFL over the last 3 years. And he was just a shell of himself against Pittsburgh due to his shoulder injury. Only played 70% of the snaps and really let Martavis Bryant do whatever he wanted, which was really surprising. This week, Chris Harris is practicing in full, which surprised me a little bit. But if we take them at their word, it's a downgrade for Edelman. But on such a short slate, there's no way I'm moving off Edelman just because I think Chris Harris is healthy.
We can now get into breaking down these 2 games, and we will start with New England at Denver. Andrew, Adam already started down the road about Gronkowski, about Edelman, about their health. Where do you start in this contest? And maybe even let's take a step back. We'll focus on New England at Denver, but how do you construct the lineup on a 2-game slate? Is this simply finding the best plays you can find and hoping for a little bit of variance in ownership?
I think it's a tough slate in the sense that there's not a lot of good value. And we've got the point in the season now where they've lowered the floor for the receivers. So you have 2 receivers in Kotri and Brown that I think are playable that are under $3K. So you got to kind of consider them. And Adam said he's only considering 2 tight ends, but I throw Owen Daniels in the mix at 2.3K as well. You're not going to feel good about any one of those guys I just mentioned, but if you can get, 4 catches for 50 yards at that price, I think that's going to be enough on a slate like this, and it allows you to pay up for some other people. So I'm going to try and fit in Gronkowski. I think he's a priority for me. I mean, we saw what he did last week. There aren't a lot of guys on the slate that have the upside that he has this week. And if he goes out and has a game like he did last week and you don't have him, you're pretty much toast. So I definitely prefer him over Olsen. He's only $500 more. I just think he's got a much higher ceiling. And you've got Bruce Arians coming out saying they're going to do everything they can to stop Greg Olsen. So I'm not totally focusing on the slate here, but just kind of hitting on that particular game, but hitting the tight end issue. Gronk is definitely priority for me. Edelman as well, I think, is a priority. The targets are going to be there. He should be, 100% now. It's a tough matchup, but with the short slate, you can't really be picking and choosing. And he's a guy that you can feel really comfortable about him probably approaching 7-8 catches and 100 yards. And that's a lot right here.
Now, Geoff, if we look at this contest, we see Denver with one of the, if not the top defense in the league all season long. But on the other side of the ball, we have Tom Brady, and we know what he does in the playoffs. We know what they can do at full strength, as we saw last week, how Edelman makes this offense go. Can you take anything at all from Tom Brady's history playing in Denver? Is there anything to be drawn from his lack of success in Denver, in the playoffs, in the regular season, or is this a different beast because of Peyton Manning not having the arm strength and not having the ability to most likely put up big points?
Yeah, I know I've heard stories about how Tom Brady doesn't like to play in Denver as well and stuff like that. I'm not a huge believer in anything, especially just because every year is different in the NFL. So I'm not a big believer in, he didn't have success there like 3 years ago or something like that, that you shouldn't play him just based on that. I do think that the Denver defense right now is, I wouldn't say it's gettable, but it's more gettable than it was at the start of the year. We saw Pittsburgh get after them with some pretty big passing games the last 2 times they played them. And I think that the Patriots at full strength now in their passing offense can get after the Denver defense a bit. Denver hasn't scored double-digit fantasy points since like week 7 or 8 or something like that. So they're not this dominant fantasy force that some people may think they are right now. They're a very good defense with a lot of solid players, and they could still win this game. But I think that targeting the New England offense is for most purposes going to be a safe play. I think Tom Brady, for me, he's probably going to be the 3rd most owned quarterback on the slate if I had to guess right now. And I think that makes him a pretty good play. I think that you'll get a little bit lower ownership, but with a player who's definitely capable of throwing over 300 yards, a couple touchdowns. Brady's thrown for multiple touchdowns, and I think it was 9 of his last 13 playoff games. So I do like him from that perspective. The one thing I'd say about this game is that I think there's going to be a lot of popular plays in the NFC games. So especially at running back with Jonathan Stewart and David Johnson. I really like targeting maybe one of those Denver running backs. CJ Anderson has played really well lately. I also like James White. I think he could be deployed more this week just because the secondary in Denver is so good. I think he played so much last week. He played over 70% of the snaps, didn't have that many targets, but I really like him as like a GPP target this week.
Adam, turning your way, and I'll leave Peyton Manning to you. What are ownership percentage should we see for Peyton Manning? And what ownership percentage will we see because of being such a short slate and people trying to be a little contrarian by playing the man with the fused neck?
Yeah, I mean, the Broncos screwed themselves here. They're going to blow their playoff run because they were, submitted to political pressure and put Peyton Manning back in.
They got nostalgic for years past. That's all.
They really, I mean, I would be livid if I was a Broncos fan. But anyways, I mean, Peyton Manning's played 10 full games this year. He has thrown 9 touchdown passes in those games. He has 2 300-yard games. Like in today's NFL, 300 yards is the norm. Throwing multiple touchdown passes in a game is the norm. So
let's remember Trent Dilfer on this day. Let us all remember the great. No, go on.
Yeah, but that's how Trent Dilfer, that's how Peyton Manning plays now. It's like that's so unfantasy friendly. I know Peyton will be by far and away the lowest owned quarterback. I just don't think the ceiling is there. I know that he's like 2K cheaper than the other guys. I would just be absolutely shocked if Peyton Manning threw for over 300 yards and multiple touchdowns.
Any other pieces, though, as Geoff was describing, either Hillman, CJ Anderson, somebody from the Denver backfield, or is Demaryius Thomas that one target of Manning who may have a decent output?
Yeah, no, I think CJ Anderson will be kind of chalky. I mean, he was reasonably well owned last week, and then we got a little bit of clarity. I mean, he outplayed Ronnie Hillman. They split the snaps and touches pretty evenly, but he did outplay Hillman, and he did seize the goal line opportunity that he had, whereas Hillman got stuffed. I think it'll be a relatively even split again, but I do think CJ will be the higher owned guy. I'm fine with Hillman as a contrarian play, but if you're looking to play it safe, I think CJ is the slightly better play.
Andrew, anybody else from this contest that we haven't mentioned? You already touched on the low price guys. Is that a must here, at least considering the likes of Cotchery, of the likes of maybe a fourth wide receiver from New England who may get run in this contest?
Yeah, you could look at LaFell. I'm not particularly interested in him. He's a little banged up. He just hasn't done anything all season long, even when he had the opportunity with all the injuries, and now everyone's healthy. Geoff hit on James White briefly. I like him quite a bit. He didn't do much last game. I think he had one carry. And he had 2 receptions, I believe. One of them was a longer one. But I'd expect a little bit more out of him. The Denver defense is good at stopping the run, but they do give up some receptions to running backs. And then one last thing about Peyton Manning, which is pretty crazy, that I saw this morning. Tom Brady threw more touchdown passes in Denver this season than Peyton, 3-1.
That is a stat that I've seen tossed around, and one that will, I'm sure, be thrown out there to start the game. And we'll see what happens for Peyton Manning and whether or not he can conjure some old goodness, or if his what was it, withered? I think that Adam said last week when referring to Peyton Manning.
So withered.
I wonder if Brock Osweiler will score more points than Peyton Manning this week.
Calling for a QB switch.
They're going to need to do something. If Manning's not effective early, there needs.
It's 20-0 at halftime. You'll see Brock Osweiler in second.
Hey, the one thing about Peyton is he's a unique price point in a week that it's really difficult to. It's a tight cap, and no one's going to play him, and you never know. I mean, he might have something left in there. I think for a tournament play, stacking with Demaryius, it's risky, but I think it makes some sense.
No, he'll throw like 3 bubble screens to Demaryius. Like maybe Demaryius will like run over 3 guys and like leap over 4 guys, and Peyton can get his yards that way.
Stranger things have happened. We can move on to the Arizona-Carolina game, Andrew. And as we talked about, seems like a bit of chalk here at running back with David Johnson and Jonathan Stewart. But you also have Palmer and Cam Newton, who are going to be highly owned. You throw in the wide receivers from Arizona and the resurrection of Larry Fitzgerald after that big catch and run last week. Where do you see ownership going for Arizona? And if you had to choose one of these wideouts, would you be on Fitzgerald or would you be looking elsewhere?
Yeah, I think Fitzgerald is the receiver I would look at in this game just because he's in the slot the most of all those guys, and so he can avoid Norman. I'm concerned about Norman being on Floyd or Brown. Now, he's not going to be on any – I don't think he's going to shadow him. Maybe Adam can comment on that. I could be wrong. But all the receivers I'm a little bit concerned about. I think Fitz is a little too expensive. I prefer looking at Demaryius or Edelman for not a ton more, but it's close. So if you like Fitz, go ahead and play him. As far as Jonathan Stewart, I don't think you should anticipate what you saw last week, especially now he's a little bit banged up. I would rather save the money and go down to probably CJ Anderson or James White, or I think David Johnson's a guy that you have to lock in your lineups if you're playing cash games. If you want to fade him in tournaments, that's fine. But he's kind of the standout running back play this week. And as far as quarterback, Cam to me is the guy that I'm going to be trying to get in all my lineups. I think he's just a little bit of a cut above Brady. He's $200 cheaper. He's at home. He's got a higher team total. It's kind of got everything in his favor. I know he didn't have a good game last week, but I expect some of those touchdowns that went to Stewart and Artis Payne, maybe they go to Cam this week.
Cam made some excellent throws last week, whether or not they resulted in touchdowns or not. He was on point in a good deal. And we've seen all season long when his running backs are banged up, Cam likes to call his own number more often than not than somebody who's in there in the red zone. So maybe those translate to more Cam points, as you just said. Now, Geoff, what about this contest and what about cheaper options? Are there guys down the depth charts who you're willing to take some risk on in tournament plays?
For Arizona, I think most of the wide receivers will be fairly well owned. I'd have to guess that maybe John Brown might be the least chalky of the Cardinals wide receivers. But again, he might also see the most of Josh Norman. So it's hard to recommend him as like a great tournament option. But that being said, John Brown, he just really needs one play to go big. So if you're really looking to differentiate, I don't think he's necessarily a bad play. Just know what you're getting into. He might have the toughest matchup. I think that the more likely scenario looking for good value plays is going to be in the Carolina wide receiver core. So you have Philly Brown, you have Ted Ginn. I expect Patrick Peterson to probably shadow Ted Ginn around the field just because he's been so productive as a deep option. And I think it makes sense to see Peterson shadow Ginn, although, I haven't exactly 100% guarantee that or anything like that. But I think Philly Brown might be an interesting option. I think Devin Funchess could be in play as well. Funchess came on a little bit at the end of the year when he's given more opportunities. It's tough to say. It's tough to say how much and either one of these guys will see target-wise or just even playing-wise. Funchess was limited in his snaps when all of the Carolina wide receivers were healthy. So I might lean towards Philly Brown being the better option there. I think he's just a little bit more reliable, probably see a few more snaps. I think that if I was going for like a Carolina GPP pick, I think he'd probably be the guy to target. I do like Greg Olsen a little bit. I think he's going to get a lot of targets in this game. I think he'll be relied on more. Maybe is the better option for me over Gronk this week, although it's really close. Both those guys are obviously the 1 and 2 and the only options at tight end. So, but I like looking at Carolina's passing game for sure this week.
Now, Adam, Geoff just touched on it. Gronk versus Olsen, you were talking about it earlier. Do you see one more cash viable, one more tournament option where ownership percentages could vary between the two? Or is this simply a 50-50 sort of week where you take one depending on what quarterback you're going with in lineup construction?
Yeah, I mean, everybody's going to be on Gronk because of last week, Everybody's like, oh, Gronk is back. I mean, he still only got 8 targets, which has kind of been the issue all year. I think the reason I just think he's slightly better play, I think New England could go really pass heavy in this spot, and just the touchdown upside is so much higher with Gronk. And like Andrew alluded to, I mean, it's not really a question of salary and all that and fades and all that. Like, you have to have in a 2-game slate, you just have to have the guys that score, period. Like, there's no other way around it. There's no way to say, well, I'm not going to play Gronk because he's not going to, he's only going to have 7 for 70. Like, if you miss out on 7 for 70, you're missing out on a ton on this slate.
All right, gents, great content. We're going to round it out with 2 questions for you. We're going to go a little around the horn here. We'll start with Adam. The questions are, 1, who are you building lineups around? Who is the guy, any price point that you feel is where you're going to start your lineup construction? The second question is, which may be a different answer, and this may be more of a hot take or a gut check question. Who do you think is the highest scoring player of this week? May not be the guy that you want to roster, but maybe for some reason or another you think is going to have a breakout or have some big output. So, Adam, you first, roster construction starting point, and then who do you think is going to be the highest scoring player of the week?
Hold on, you better go to somebody else. The
mail came, and apparently my question was not well liked in the Levitan household, which is fine. I get it. I've had worse reactions to questions I've asked before. Andrew, let's start with you. Who are you starting roster construction around, and who do you think is going to be the highest scoring player on this slate of 2 games?
I think David Johnson at running back is kind of a layup play so I'm just going to throw that one aside because it's kind of obvious. So I think at wide receiver, the play that I like the most is probably Demaryius Thomas. All the wide receiver plays have their warts, but the volume should be there for him. And I just think that he's going to be heavily involved, and they're probably going to be behind and throwing the ball. So I could easily see him getting 10 catches for over 100 yards, and you just hope that he finds the end zone. But even without it, I think he's going to be one of the higher scoring players of the slate.
And now, Adam, we ready to come back to the real star of the show? Or I want to.
We're ready. The mail has arrived, so everybody can go back to what they were doing.
Finally, we get Jerry's pick. Finally.
Yeah, Jerry likes Cam Newton to start lineups with this week, and she thinks it's because of his legs. I mean, we've seen Cam against teams that play a lot of man run better, and that makes a lot of sense. Sometimes defensive backs have their back to guys, and Arizona is notorious for playing a lot of man. Obviously, they'll be aware of Cam Newton's rushing ability, but I still think that he puts a lot on his shoulders in this game. The Super Bowl is on the line. I think we could see him run 10, 12, 15 times, and for that reason, I'm starting my lineup with him, and I think he'll be the highest scoring player on the slate.
And Geoff, to round it out, to you? Where you're starting your roster construction and who you think?
I do like Cam Newton this week, but I think that actually I'm going to be going the other direction. I think I'm going to be using a lot of Carson Palmer and a lot of Larry Fitzgerald. I like the fact the Cardinals are slight underdogs. You haven't seen that much this year. And when they have got behind in some games, the Cleveland game comes to mind. Carson Palmer's had massive games. Like when he has to throw a lot and when he's forced into throwing a lot and going quick pace, he piles up the points. And I really like Larry Fitzgerald playing from the slot a lot. I think that could be also maybe a little bit lower owned. And I think that's probably where I'm going to be starting a lot of my rosters.
Great content. As always, gentlemen, you can find them across the DraftKings properties on Playbook, on DKTV. You have Adam finishing up the DFS Edge podcast with CSU Ram and Al Zeidenfeld. Great content all year long. Check it out on iTunes. You can always go back and learn plenty from those three throughout the season. You have Andrew Wiggins with the DFS Edge podcast for NBA with Notorious. That's available on iTunes. And Geoff across the DK Playbook and DK TV with golf and a variety of other sports as well. So keep it tuned to these guys. They know what they're talking about when it comes to daily fantasy. Best of luck in this championship round, the final week of NFL here on DraftKings. Hope you guys had a great year. We'll see you back next year, of course, with all of these preview shows on DK TV. Wish you the best of luck and have a great winter, guys.